Greetings, historians. Today we're going to start our discussion of what might just be the oldest civilization that we're aware of. The oldest civilization that has an archaeological record showing urbanization, showing development, and showing some cultural unity in creating a real and specific society rather than simply a series of settlements. So, in ancient Mesopotamia, we find many of the first artifacts, many of the earliest ruins from what we would call today to be a major civilization. Certainly, people lived for many thousands of years before this in various nomadic or semi-nomadic groups, but in ancient Mesopotamia, we're looking at the first development of a largely sedentary people. So people who largely use agriculture rather than any sort of hunting and gathering or fishing primarily as a source of food, right? So when you're using agriculture, it means that you have to stay in the same place all year to tend to your crops and then harvest them and prepare your fields to be sown again during the next season. So we have much more cultural development in a situation where people are likely to stay around the same location and around each other for a longer period of time. So let's jump into ancient Mesopotamia. So, as I alluded to, people had been living in different types of groups for many thousands of years. So we might have different kinship groups, nomadic peoples following things like herds of grazing animals that would be a good source of food, staying near bodies of water that were a good source of food through fishing, or really just following the natural landscape in terms of where food could be foraged, where it sort of naturally grew. People started to settle, though, in areas that happened to be rich for agriculture. So we'll talk more about exactly how agriculture began in Mesopotamia in a separate reading. So we just want to go into the basic idea that the area of ancient Mesopotamia, so the modern Middle East, especially the area that is now Iraq and parts of Syria, despite our modern conception of this being kind of an arid place, is actually, both at the time and still a bit today, a very fertile area, especially along the major rivers, which we'll talk about. So, Mesopotamia actually means between the rivers in ancient Greek. The rivers that we're talking about are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Both of these rivers begin high up in the mountains of Anatolia, so to the north of what we would call the Middle East today. And so these rivers ran down from the mountains through the plains of southern Mesopotamia. This meant a couple of things. This meant that there was a pretty good regular source of water. It meant that the snowmelt from the mountains and the high level of precipitation up in the mountains would eventually run through the plains, which were flat enough for good agriculture to develop, and make sure that the area always had access to water. Because the rivers were flowing down from the mountains, it also ensured that the water actually carried with it a lot of really important nutrients from the soil. So basically, flowing down the mountains, the rivers were able to pick up nutrients as they went downstream, and these would be deposited along the banks of the river as it reached the plains. This mixture of important nutrients and minerals is called silt, and it's something that we'll study really whenever we're looking at a major river system. However, the negatives of this river system, the Tigris and Euphrates beginning up in the mountains, was that this also meant that their level was heavily dependent on how much precipitation there happened to be quite a bit ways away up in the mountains of northern Mesopotamia. If there was a lot of precipitation that year, then eventually later on that season, water would make its way down, and there would be flooding along both of the rivers. If there was less snow in the mountains at the beginning of the season, there'd be less to melt, and then the levels would be lower. Likewise, you would get a lot more seasonal flooding at times where there was high precipitation or when snow was melting up in the mountains, and less water at other times. So while both rivers were an incredibly good and important source of water, they were both also kind of an imprecise source of water. Sometimes there might be less water than you want, and sometimes there might be much more water than you could expect. And both of these things could obviously lead to problems. You need a certain amount of water, but if you have much more than you expect, especially suddenly if it's seasonal flooding from precipitation, that could cause a lot of damage to the surrounding communities, as they would want to plant their crops as close to the rivers as possible so that they can easily transport water to feed their crops. However, of course, the closer you are to the river, the more likely it is that all of your farms or fields would be drowned in a flood. So early agriculturalists had to develop ways to harness the power of these rivers, to harness all of their benefits for their civilization while avoiding the negative consequences of settling so close to major water sources. Nevertheless, they were able to do so, and we'll talk about how they were able to do so effectively that we kind of think of the area today as a landscape that we call the Fertile Crescent. So extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, it's an area within the otherwise more arid space of the Middle East where there is an especially high amount of water, even if it's not necessarily in the form of precipitation, right? So it might not rain all that often, but the rivers tend to stay at pretty good levels because it does rain up in the mountains, right? So throughout the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates made agriculture relatively easy compared to other areas of the world, civilization was able to develop. So we might mean different things when we talk about civilization in different contexts, but in terms of ancient history, we're going to call a civilization an organized society within a specific area. Often civilizations include urbanization, so they include cities that are large enough to be considered large for the time, and some ancient cities did reach appreciable size, but obviously not as big as some modern cities today. And in these cities, we would expect to see different classes of people, either different social classes or different classes according to profession, which essentially talks about division of labor, right? When we have enough people farming successfully, then civilization creates enough food, and not everybody needs to be a farmer. People can do other things as well, which leads to more specialization. It leads to things like the development of writing, which we'll talk about, a formal education, the development of art and architecture. So we would expect different civilizations to have different combinations and expressions of these things. We also have the development of things like governments. So let's think about why we see the development of government as civilizations develop, especially when they stay in one area, right? So for nomadic people, there's a lot of different models of leadership, some with much stronger authority and some where people are more or less equal. But when we talk about civilizations that tend to stay in one place and need to use agriculture in order to thrive, you almost always have a fairly official and authoritative government forming very quickly. Sometimes this is in the form of royalty, sometimes it's in the form of theocracies or governments based around religious ideas, and usually there's a mix of these things. But let's think about why we need a government. So, a government, as we talked about, can help people not only cooperate and make decisions, but also, and probably more basically, helps to organize the level of group labor that is essential for a civilization. So what exactly do we mean by that? So although Mesopotamia did have very fertile soil, it doesn't necessarily mean that farming was easy. Like we said, the region receives not very much rain at all, and so the rivers are really the important sources of water. But it's hard to water an entire field of crops just because it happens to be near the river. The soil might be fairly fertile for that reason, but you're not going to be able to easily actually get that water to your crops. And likewise, because if the crops are too close to the actual banks of the river, a flood could so easily drown the fields, there was a lot of subtlety in exactly where you should plant and when you should harvest. So it took many generations to build up the amount of agricultural success that could lead to some of these urban communities. But either way, you had a problem where you needed to be close enough to the water for it to be useful, but if you got too close, then you were certainly in a lot of danger. So one of the main problems in ancient Mesopotamia was learning how to control water, learning how to harness the power of these two mighty rivers for the greater benefit of society. So Mesopotamians developed various methods of irrigation as a way of supplying water to an area of land. So to irrigate their land, they would dig out large storage basins to hold water. They would dig canals, which either connected other waterways or channeled water from a larger waterway like the river itself into a smaller canal. Human-made waterways that connected storage basins to the canals, and networks of ditches that ran through the fields and around different towns and villages, right? So essentially, they were trying to do two things. They were trying to stop water from overflowing areas where they didn't want it to, and they wanted to encourage water to flow into the areas where they did want it, right? These are the two basic things. So things that stop water are things like building up the banks of the river, by constructing dams to stop water from flowing over the edges, or to hold water in place until it reached a certain level. So you can build dams and other sorts of levees for all of those. But really the main work was in digging these irrigation canals. So essentially you would start off in the river and you would kind of dig a trench out from the banks. And if you've ever dug around, on the beach and watched how the water went through the different channels that you create in the sand, you realize that you can direct where the water goes by digging a trench in a particular direction. So they would dig trenches off of the main waterways and into the fields themselves. This would have the effect of bringing water naturally throughout and closer to their crops, but it would also channel the water away from the river itself to decrease the total amount of water in the actual river, meaning it would be less likely to flood. So all of these were important systems for controlling water. But to connect it back to the need for government, just think about the amount of labor that's required for this. If you've ever dug appreciably in the ground, you know that it's actually a lot harder than it seems. And even digging a pretty small hole or trench can occupy a person for most of a day. So in order to build canals that would actually channel water through agricultural fields, you needed a couple of things. The first thing you needed was a huge amount of labor. You needed a lot of people working long hours on hard manual labor digging these trenches. And that is just not something that it's easy to get people to do if you don't have any kind of overall organization. Because again, think about it. People who are digging all day, they need to eat. They need all of their needs met as well if they're going to be digging all day. And they're not getting all of these resources that they need from their own farms because they're spending all of their time digging, right? So we know right away, if we need this many people working, then we need a way to feed this number of people. So we need to take food from other areas and distribute it to the workers, and already you can see why this is going to require some sort of large organizational force like a government. We also need the idea that creating these canals will help everybody, even if you're not a farmer, right? So if you're a craft person and you live in a city and you make pottery or something like that, you still need to appreciate the value of other people digging these canals, right? And the people who are digging the canals need to understand that even though if it's not their farm that they're digging on currently, that this is still to their benefit overall. Otherwise, it'd be unlikely to be able to get people to do this. So you need some sort of community-based goals. You need community-based reasons why people are donating this labor. And so we have the development of governments that organize labor, they organize big construction efforts, and that also help to distribute some of the surplus that's created by this better irrigation, right? So surplus essentially means when there's more food than is technically needed, or any resource really. When you have more food than is technically needed, you can save it up. You can use it when you don't have the required amount of food. Or you can distribute it to people who are not farming because they're doing other useful tasks, right? So we need to get this surplus, and then we also need to decide how to use it in order to help society the most, right? So the governments of ancient Mesopotamia were largely focused on these two things, on ensuring the grain supply by making sure that irrigation was working properly, waterworks were being constructed, and by making sure that the surplus food that resulted was being distributed in a way that ensured all parts of society had enough food so that they can focus on their more specialized tasks. So we see governments develop around these, and indeed, most of the early government writings that we find in ancient Mesopotamia are all about, creating lists of the amount of barley that's available, creating lists of the amount of land that is good for farming and the land that is slightly less good for farming, deciding how much barley people should be given for creating a wagon wheel or something else that they might be crafting, right? So governments arose because we needed to deal with all of these issues. If we didn't, we just wouldn't be able to live in large urbanized areas, right? You need a certain amount of cooperation and organization, and that's the role of governments in early civilizations. So next, we want to talk a little bit more about this division of labor that I alluded to. When we do have surplus, because agriculture is being effectively engineered, we have enough water, we have enough land, people are able to grow more food than they actually need. However, this doesn't result in just everybody continuing to farm and just having excess grain, right? That's not really what we would want as our civilization. Instead, we would want some of the surplus food to be given to people who are not farming at all, right? Now, that might seem a little unfair, but we realize that the idea is that if these people aren't farming at all, they can specialize in other areas, right? So I can learn to be a blacksmith if I'm not planting barley all day. I can learn to tame oxen so that then we have some oxen to work on our farm. I can engineer a new levee system if I'm not busy digging the old one. I can specialize in making clothing or pottery or jewelry. And so suddenly, if I'm able to acquire this extra food, I can then spend my time getting really good at a more specific area of labor. Maybe something that's not literally necessary, right? Like making jewelry is not essential to survival, but I can spend some time or even all of my time doing that if I can be assured that I'm still going to get a share of the surplus food. And this works out for everybody because then our society also has some of these luxury items like better clothing or shoes, jewelry or other important or even just pleasant things that make life a little bit better for our early civilizations, right? So our society becomes more and more complex as we increase the amount of specialization and the number of divisions of the labor overall. Having people work different jobs meant that overall we were able to accomplish more, right? Large projects that we're talking about also require a lot of specialized work as well. So even if you're building your irrigation system and you need a lot of workers, it's not like everybody is just digging a ditch. You also need people who really specialize in making bricks. You need engineers who specialize in knowing how water flows. You need people who specialize in surveying the land and determining, at what slope the things should be dug and all of that. It actually requires a lot of different specialization. And so over time, Mesopotamian settlements continue to grow in size and complexity. As you have division of labor, it increases exponentially because your large projects can be even better when you have all of these specialized workers. And so cities kind of gradually developed between 4000 and 3000 BCE, right? So people had already been living, in communities for many thousands of years, but the appearance of these large urbanized centers we would peg more to that time, right? So these cities would grow from the surrounding areas where you had good agriculture and you had a lot of specialization, meaning that people can perform other tasks. And when people don't have to live in the fields because they're not necessarily farming every day, they can also create more built-up urban areas. They can build cities. You might want to live closer to other people if you have a trade that depends on your access to other people, such as making clothing or anything like that. So this is a very basic overview of why ancient Mesopotamian civilization developed pretty much where they did and what the first most important aspects of it were, right? So we happen to be talking about an area of land between two very consistent rivers that had a lot of good rainfall up in the mountains. We had flooding that was good enough to bring in a lot of silt, but not so bad that it couldn't be tamed with early irrigation systems. And we have the idea that the requirement to construct these irrigation systems needed a level of organized labor that required both the government and people to stay in the same place and live closer together. Because this ended up being successful, and because there was such a surplus of food, we had more complex civilization begin to develop. So this is a very simple overview of how we get these sedentary civilizations. We'll certainly talk more about it, but I think that's, enough for now. So I will talk to you later, historians. Until then, have a wonderful exploration of the text.